Okay, greetings everyone. Welcome to the first of our online lectures. I hope that you're all staying healthy and I hope that this technology works. Okay, so today we move out of the early Middle Ages and into the so-called High Middle Ages. I mean, really, they're just the Middle Ages, but historians tend to refer to them as the High Middle Ages. They are a time of great change. Okay, over that 400-year period from 900 to 1300, there are great changes that occur in Europe. And that'll be the subject of our next 3 or 4 lectures. Okay, we've been talking about the early Middle Ages, basically 500 to 900. The lens through which we viewed the early Middle Ages was through people groups. Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, etc. We could continue that into the High Middle Ages if we wished, but instead I like to examine the High Middle Ages through the lens of estates. Okay, now what do I mean by estates? Estates are, well, medieval people themselves divided everyone in Christendom into 3 different groups. First estate, second estate, third estate, or those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. And there's an illustration of your classic, your 3 medieval estates. All right? And this is true wherever you are, whether you're in England or Spain or France or Germany, there are going to be representatives of each of these estates. The first thing you meet when you someone, what estate are you in? And there's various ways to signal which estate you're in. Now, as I say, these groups, those who pray, those who fight, those who work, that's kind of an inaccurate way of putting it, all right? Because everyone prays and everyone works in their way. But when we talk about the first estate, when we talk about those who pray, really we are talking about employees of the church. We're talking about monks and we're talking about priests, okay? And the figure on the left there is clearly, he is a member of the first estate. He's dressed in a particular garment, but check out his head. That is not male pattern baldness. That is a so-called tonsure. It's a particular way that priests and monks would shave their head to indicate that they were members of the first estate. All right, they're not like you and me. They have taken vows, and they are, well, essentially they're closer to God than you and I are. All right, so that will be our subject today. It'll be the first estate. All right, the first estate. We'll talk about the second and third estates in subsequent lectures. Okay. So, yes, there are 2 ways to be a member of the first estate. All right? And the first is if you are a monk, or I guess the general word would be a monastic. All right? Because it's important to realize that women can be monks too. They are, of course, called nuns. But women can be priests, but they can be nuns. And so women can be members of the first estate if they become nuns. And I mean, I think it's, let me just say this, monasticism is not justified by the Bible, okay? So it is not, it's one of those things that Protestant reformers got rid of in the 16th century. So there are no Lutheran monks. There are no Baptist monks or Methodist monks or Presbyterian monks or anything like that, okay? So, but, you know, obviously there are Catholic monks. And how much more was this true in the Middle Ages? Everywhere you went, you would encounter monasteries and you might see the people who live in them. Now, perhaps you might even be interested in becoming a monk. Okay? Well, if you do, it's not just a job, it's supposed to be a sacred calling. All right? And there's a price you pay for it. If you want to be a monk, you have to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. That is, you're not allowed to own anything as a monk beyond a few personal items. You can't have a bank account, you can't have real estate or anything like that. All of that gets turned over to the monastery when you join it. You are considered to be married to the church, so you cannot take a spouse, and you are supposed to refrain from sexual activity otherwise. You're supposed to be focused on matters of the spirit, not on matters of the flesh. And you live together with your fellow monks in community, and so you need someone to be in charge of that community. So every monastery is going to have an abbot or an abbess in the case of a nunnery, and their word is law within the monastery. Okay, so you are honor bound. You are, by oath, you must obey your abbot. So poverty, chastity, and obedience. Those are the vows that you take when you become a monk. What do monks do? Well, a number of interesting and important things. Famously, monks will pray 8 times a day. There are set times during the day where monks will gather in their chapel and they will sing psalms and sing hymns and hear Bible readings, and they will pray together. Okay? And this is, of course, a very important service to society. They are keeping society in good with God. All right? So you definitely want people doing this on your behalf. When they're not praying, monks will practice hospitality. If you're on a pilgrimage, you can stay at a monastery for free. Okay? A surprising number of technical inventions come out of the Middle Ages when they're not, praying. They're sitting around tinkering with stuff. The classic image of a medieval monk is sitting in the scriptorium copying out a manuscript, and there is any number of beautiful medieval manuscripts that were produced by monks in monasteries. A lot of classical heritage was preserved courtesy medieval monks. Livy, Virgil, Ovid, all of those manuscripts that have come down to us courtesy of medieval monks. And then finally, another service they provide is the acceptance of unwanted children. You can't practice infanticide in Christian Europe, unlike in pagan Rome. But, sometimes you can't afford to keep the children you have, so you can bequeath your child to a monastery, and the monks will raise it with the idea that the child will become a monk when it's old enough to take its vows. So that is another feature of another service provided by medieval monasteries. And here's a couple of illustrations. On right there, you've got a monk sitting in the scriptorium copying out a manuscript, looking very intently at it. And on the left there is a medieval manuscript. In fact, that is you see that particular Gothic font, the handwriting, I should say, with an illuminated initial. That, of course, is St. Peter carrying his key. Okay, so that's the sort of thing that a monk will produce. Okay, now, that's how it's supposed to run. All right, that is how it is supposed to run. It doesn't always run this way. There is always a gap between the expectation and the reality. And it stings in particular because it is the church. You really do expect good things out of the church. But the church is populated by humans. And humans, even if they do take vows, they're still human and they're still made of crooked timber. And so monasteries are not always as holy as you might like them to be. Okay? So there's lots of problems with monasteries. First of all, those children who were bequeathed to the monastery, they are known as child oblates, and needless to say, they didn't necessarily want to be monks. All right, but they don't have a choice in the matter. So that's a problem. Some monasteries were founded by rich people. Okay, if you're, say, the Count of Champagne, maybe you establish a monastery somewhere in Champagne, and so you populate it with monks and you get them praying full time for you. Well, that's great. But it also there's a practical effect here. I mean, since you founded the monastery, in some ways it's your monastery, and you have the right to name the abbot. Okay, now some noblemen who have founded monasteries have integrity, and they find a good, guy who'll be a great abbot. But other times they just see it as patronage. And they'll put their idiot son who never amounted to much, well, we'll make him the abbot of the monastery. We'll give him something to do. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, will he be actually good at the job? Probably not. And then finally, I don't think that the monastic lifestyle is necessarily appealing to us now. In fact, that's a big problem in the Catholic Church. People are not becoming monks or nuns like they used to. But in the Middle Ages, if the choice is between working full-time, sun up to sundown in the hot sun, or praying 8 times a day indoors and getting 3 square meals, chances are you might be interested in becoming a monk. Are you actually on fire for Jesus? Do you actually feel dedicated to living this way? No, it's just better than the alternative. All right. So there are a lot of monks who are not really into it. They're just going through the motions. Okay. And then the third point there, corporate wealth caused resentment. This is an important thing. Okay. Monks are not allowed to own anything personally. They don't own anything personally. However, as a corporation, a monastery can grow insanely wealthy, which is one of the reasons why the Vikings attacked monasteries, right? We talked about that. So if you don't want to become a monk, but you do like the idea of monks praying for you, you can make a bequest to the monastery of land, or of gold, or jewels, or vestments, or maybe you make a bell for the bell tower. All sorts of reasons why monasteries can grow very rich. And unfortunately, a lot of monasteries really jealously guard this wealth. All right? Their attitude is, we're closer to God than you are, therefore your job is to serve us. We'll pray for you, but beyond that, your job is to give us money. We don't feel obliged to share it with you. All right? So there is a certain, an arrogance on the part of monasteries. Very wealthy monasteries surrounded by poor peasants, and, all the monks will do is pray for you. They won't share their wealth necessarily with people outside of the monastery. But as I say, that's at its worst. They're not all like this. Here are some monasteries, some of the more famous ones. There's St. Catherine's in Egypt. That would be an Orthodox monastery. That's up on Mount Sinai. It has a very famous collection of manuscripts that they might let you look at if you ask them politely. To the right of that is Mont Saint-Michel, which is just off the coast of Normandy in France, a very sort of an island just off the coast with the monastery perched on top of it, very picturesque. Okay, and then at the bottom there is the latest iteration of Monte Cassino, which is in Italy. This is, in fact, is the original monastery. This one was founded by Saint Benedict himself. but of course it's been rebuilt many times over the ages, the most recent one being in the 1950s because it was an unfortunate victim of the Second World War. It got flattened by the Americans, actually, because they believed the Nazis were holed up inside of it. Okay,